As far as the war is concerned, World War, much has been written about World War II and the Greatest Generation. And I've been asked a lot of questions over the years. Some were about movies, some were about acting, some were about directing. But not long ago, somebody asked me something that was much harder to answer. They asked me, Clint, after all these years, who are the people you love the most? I had to think about that. It's easy to name the greatest actors you've worked with. It's easy to talk about the movies that made the most money or the performances that won awards, but love doesn't work that way. You don't measure it with trophies or box office numbers. You measure it by the people whose faces still come into your mind when you least expect them. Sometimes I'll be driving somewhere and suddenly remember a conversation from 40 years ago. I'll hear a piece of music and immediately think about somebody I haven't seen in decades. Sometimes I can still hear their voice as clearly as if they were standing right next to me. That's the strange thing about getting older. You forget little things. You forget where you put your glasses. You forget what you had for lunch, but you don't forget the people who really mattered. I've worked with a lot of talented people in my life. Some became friends, some came and went, and there were people I thought would always be around. Life has a way of proving you wrong. Eventually you look around and realize the set isn't as loud as it used to be. Some familiar faces are gone. Some old conversations can never happen again. So when I thought about that question, 5 names came to me, not because they were the most famous, because when I think about them, I remember good days. The first person I thought about was Sergio Leone. Before I met Sergio, things weren't exactly going my way. I'd worked in TV, I'd worked hard, I was getting opportunities. But I wasn't waking up every morning thinking Hollywood had finally figured me out. Then Sergio, an Italian director, wanted me for a Western. A lot of people thought I was crazy for doing it. The script wasn't even finished in English. The money wasn't anything special. And we were going halfway around the world to make a movie, but saying yes turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. Sergio didn't talk much on set. His English wasn't great, and my Italian was even worse. But somehow we understood each other. He could look at a scene and communicate exactly what he wanted without giving me a long explanation. I like that. I've never needed somebody standing over my shoulder telling me how to breathe or where to look. Sergio trusted the people he'd hired. That's something I've carried with me for years, especially when I started directing myself. He taught me that a scene doesn't always need more dialogue. Sometimes it needs silence. Sometimes you just have to let a moment sit there and allow the audience to lean in. I learned a lot from him without him ever sitting me down and teaching me. Away from the camera, I remember him as somebody who loved movies, food, laughter, and good conversation. There wasn't nearly as much ego there as people might imagine. When Sergio died, it felt strange. For years, you believe certain people will always be somewhere out there making another movie, thinking about another idea, then suddenly they're gone. Every once in a while, I'll watch one of those old Westerns, and for a couple of hours, I can almost imagine Sergio standing behind the camera again. The second person I have to mention is Gene Hackman. Gene was never somebody who needed to walk into a room and demand attention. He didn't have to. People noticed him anyway. I had known of Gene before we worked together, but spending time with somebody is different from watching them on a screen. That's when you really find out who they are. When we made Unforgiven, we spent a lot of long days together. Westerns aren't exactly comfortable movies to make. You're standing in the dirt, you're waiting around, the weather changes, equipment takes time to move. That gave us plenty of time to talk. Gene had this dry sense of humor that could catch you completely off guard. He'd say something with a straight face, and a few seconds later you'd realize he just made the funniest comment of the day. I always liked that, but what impressed me most was how seriously he took the work. When the camera started rolling, everything else disappeared. He wasn't thinking about awards or reviews, he was thinking about the scene as a director. That's exactly the kind of actor you want. You don't have to push somebody like Gene. You give him the direction and then you get out of his way. He understood the work. When Gene eventually decided he'd had enough of Hollywood, I understood it. This business asks a lot from people. Sometimes it asks for more than anybody realizes. There comes a point when you know you've said what you wanted to say. Gene reached that point and walked away on his own terms. I respected him for that. Whenever Unforgiven comes on TV, I don't spend much time watching myself. I watch Gene. I remember the conversations between takes, the laughs, the quiet professionalism. That's the Gene I remember. Not the awards, not the famous performances. The man who made those long days better. The third person is Merle Haggard. Some people might wonder why a country singer would be on my list. To me, it makes perfect sense. I've always loved country music. Long before people asked me about movie scores or directing, There was usually a country song playing somewhere in the background. There was something honest about it. And Merle had that honesty. When I first really spent time with him, it didn't feel like I was sitting with a celebrity. It felt like I was talking to somebody I'd known for years. He never seemed interested in pretending to be somebody he wasn't. I appreciated that. We both understood what it meant to work for what you had. Different lives, different places. But there was something familiar in the way we looked at things. Merle's music connected with people because he wasn't trying to impress them. He was telling the truth as he saw it. We'd talk about everything. Music, movies, small towns, old trucks, ranches, how quickly California was changing. Sometimes those conversations lasted much longer than either of us expected, and I liked that we never needed to fill every silence. You could sit there for a minute without saying anything, and it never felt uncomfortable as the years passed. We didn't see each other as often. That's life. People get busy. Everybody goes in different directions. But whenever we met again, it felt like we'd never stopped talking. That's how you know a friendship is real. When I heard Merle was gone, I didn't have much to say. I went for a drive, I turned on the radio and found one of his songs. His voice filled the truck, and for a little while it felt like he was riding along with me again. That's how I remember Merle, not by the records he sold. I remember him because every conversation made the world seem a little less complicated. And that's something I miss. The fourth person is Donald Sutherland. Donald was one of those people who could make you curious without even trying. I'd sit down with him for 5 minutes, and suddenly we'd be talking about history, books, politics, or some movie neither of us had seen in 30 years. He seemed to know something about everything. I admired that in this business. It's easy to spend your entire life talking about yourself. Donald was more interested in asking questions. That's rare. Whenever our paths crossed, we'd usually talk longer than we planned. I don't remember every conversation anymore. I remember how those conversations made me feel. Donald wasn't trying to teach anybody a lesson. He simply enjoyed exchanging ideas. He listened. He was curious, and he had very little ego about it. Of course, everybody knew what a remarkable actor he was. He could disappear into almost any role, but that's not what I remember first. I remember him between takes a cup of coffee in his hands in his pockets, that quiet smile. Talking about something that had absolutely nothing to do with the movie. Those are the moments that stay with you. Over the years, we'd run into each other at premieres, award shows, or somebody's dinner party. There was never any pressure to catch up on everything. A handshake, a laugh, a few stories. That was enough. When I heard Donald had died, it stopped me for a while. At our age, you understand that those phone calls are coming. That doesn't make them easier. You start looking around and realize there are fewer familiar faces than there used to be. I sometimes wish I could sit down with Donald one more time. No cameras, no audience, just two old actors with a couple of coffees letting an afternoon disappear. The fifth person is Morgan Freeman. Some friendships don't need a lot of words. That's how I've always felt about Morgan. The first time we worked together, I knew I was dealing with somebody who understood the rhythm of a movie. He never forced a scene, he never tried to steal it. He trusted the story, and somehow that made everyone around him better. As a director, you notice that. You notice the actors who make your job easier. Morgan was one of them. He'd arrived knowing exactly what he wanted to do, but he was never stubborn about it. If you had an idea, he'd listen. If something wasn't working, he'd help fix it. He didn't point fingers. I've always respected that. People see Morgan and immediately think about his voice. I understand why. It's unforgettable. But after you've spent enough time around him, you stop noticing the voice, you notice the man. He's patient, he's thoughtful, and he treats the crew the same way he treats the stars. I've always believed that tells you more about somebody than anything they do in front of a camera. Morgan also had a calmness about him. Movie sets can become chaotic very quickly. Schedules change, weather changes, equipment breaks. Everybody is trying to solve a different problem. Morgan rarely seemed rattled. He had a way of slowing the room down without saying much. I think every set needs somebody like that. When we made $1 Million Baby, there were days that demanded a lot emotionally. Those kinds of scenes aren't easy. You carry some of them home with you. Having Morgan there made those days easier, not because he had all the answers, because his presence reminded everybody that we were in good hands. I've worked with a lot of talented people. Very few could make the people around them feel as comfortable as Morgan did. That's a gift you can't teach these days. When I hear his voice on TV, I don't think about awards. I don't think about famous performances. I think about mornings on set coffee before the cameras rolled, a quiet joke between takes, a conversation that had nothing to do with the movie. Those are the memories that stay. I've had a long career, longer than I ever expected. I've made movies I'm proud of, and I've made a few I'd probably do differently. That's life. You keep moving. You keep learning, but the older I get, the more I realize the things I remember most had very little to do with success. They had everything to do with people. When I think about Sergio, I think about trust. When I think about Gene, I remember those long afternoons between scenes. Merle reminds me that the simplest conversations can become the memories you treasure most. Donald reminds me to stay curious. And Morgan reminds me that kindness can change the entire feeling of a room. Those are lessons I didn't learn in an acting class. I learned them by living. If there's one thing age has taught me, it's that careers eventually become history, movies become old, awards gather dust, but people become memories. And when the room gets quiet, those memories are what remain. I'm grateful I had these 5 people in my life. I only wish I could sit down with each of them one more time, not to talk about movies, not to talk about careers, just to ask them how they've been. I think that would be enough, because at the end of the day, that's what I've come to understand. The greatest part of a long life isn't how many movies you make. It's how many people you were lucky enough to love.